Give me a real waiter, not some lowlife. The restaurant went silent. Every eye turned toward the table in the corner, where a group of tourists sat with smug grins, their expensive watches glinting under the warm chandelier lights. The words had just left the mouth of a man wearing a gold chain and sunglasses indoors. His voice dripped with arrogance, his tone sharp as a blade. Dante, the waiter, a tall black man with kind eyes and a patience most wouldn't have, stood frozen for a second. He had just politely asked if they were ready to order when the insult hit him like a slap across the face. The other tourists at the table snickered. One of them, a blonde woman in a designer dress, took a sip of wine and smirked. I mean, no offense, but don't you have anything better to do than serve people like us? The tension in the air was suffocating. Customers and staff alike held their breath, waiting for Dante's reaction. But what he did next would leave the entire restaurant in shock. Rude tourists insult a black waiter. Then he gives them a lesson they'll never forget. Dante didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. Instead, he took a deep breath and smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made the tourists shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Is that right?" he said, voice calm but firm. "Well, I hope you're hungry because I'm about to serve you something you'll never forget." The tourists laughed again, but this time, their laughter felt forced. A few customers murmured, intrigued by Dante's response. What did he mean? What was he planning? But before they could figure it out, the story had already begun long before this moment. The restaurant La Bellevue was one of the finest in town, a place where the wealthy dined. The ambience was rich with jazz music, the clinking of glasses, and the aroma of exquisite dishes. It was the kind of place where people didn't just eat, they experienced food. Dante had worked here for 3 years. He wasn't just a waiter, he was one of the best. His service was impeccable, his recommendations always perfect. He treated every customer with respect, no matter who they were. And yet, he wasn't naive. He had dealt with his share of difficult customers before. The rude ones, the arrogant ones, the ones who thought his skin color made him less than them. But tonight, something felt different. It started when the group of tourists walked in, 4 of them. They were loud, flashy, and full of themselves, acting like they owned the place. One of the women, a brunette with too much perfume, snapped her fingers at Dante like he was a dog. "We need a table," she said without looking up from her phone. Dante, ever the professional, gave them a polite smile and led them to their seats. But even as he did, he could feel the way they looked at him. Not like a person, like he was just there, like he didn't matter. He ignored it. He had a job to do. The night went on, and the tourists ordered the most expensive items on the menu. Dante served them flawlessly, but their attitude only got worse. One of the men, who had introduced himself loudly as Mr. Kane, mocked Dante's accent when he spoke. Another woman deliberately knocked over a glass of water, then laughed as Dante cleaned it up. It was humiliating, but Dante said nothing. Not yet. Then, as he returned to take their final orders, Kane leaned back in his chair, pointed a finger, and sneered, "You know, back where we come from, people like you don't serve food. They clean floors." And just like that, the night exploded. Gasps rippled through the restaurant. A couple near the window shook their heads in disgust. Even the pianist playing in the corner missed a note. Dante's hand tightened around his notepad. For a brief moment, his jaw clenched. But then, something shifted. He exhaled slowly. A glint of something unreadable flickered in his eyes. Then he smiled. And that smile was the beginning of something these tourists would never forget. A thick, awkward silence spread across the restaurant like spilled wine. The air felt heavy, thick with tension. Every customer, every staff member, even the chef peeking from the kitchen, everyone was waiting to see what Dante would do. The tourists at the table still had smug looks on their faces. They expected Dante to get angry, maybe even lash out. That's what they wanted. But instead, Dante's smile only grew. Not a fake one, not forced, but a genuine, confident, almost mischievous smile. "You know what, sir?" he said, his voice smooth and steady. "You're absolutely right. People like me don't just serve food. We create experiences." Kane raised an eyebrow, confused. "And since you're our guest tonight, let me make sure you get an experience you'll never forget." With that, Dante turned and walked away, leaving the table stunned. Dante headed straight to the kitchen, but not before stopping by his manager, Carlos. Carlos was an older man, wise and fair, and had always treated Dante like family. "I heard everything," Carlos said in a low voice. "You okay?" "I'm fine," Dante said, grabbing a tray. "But I need you to trust me." Carlos studied him for a moment before nodding. "You always handle things with class. Do what you gotta do." That was all Dante needed. He stepped into the kitchen and gave the chef a simple request. "Give me the special." The chef, a middle-aged Frenchman named Pierre, grinned knowingly. "Ah, I see what you were doing." In exactly 10 minutes, Dante emerged from the kitchen carrying a large, covered silver platter. The weight of it was undeniable, not just physically, but in the energy surrounding it. All eyes followed him as he approached the tourist table. The tourists themselves were laughing amongst themselves again, as if nothing had happened. Then, with one swift motion, Dante placed the platter in front of Cain and slowly lifted the lid. The tourists leaned in, and then they froze. Their eyes widened. Their mouths fell open. The smirks, the arrogance, the smugness, gone in an instant. Because sitting on the platter, beautifully plated, was a raw, unseasoned, completely untouched steak. Not cooked, not grilled, just a plain slab of cold, red meat. The entire restaurant gasped. The blonde woman wrinkled her nose in disgust. "What the?" Cain scowled. "What the hell is this?" Dante placed both hands behind his back, standing tall. My apologies, sir. You see, I assumed you wouldn't want something prepared by someone like me. So, I left it just the way you might prefer it. Untouched." A few customers chuckled. The message was clear. Cain's face turned red. "This isn't funny." Dante didn't flinch. "Neither is racism, sir." Boom. The room went dead silent. For the first time that night, Cain and his friends had nothing to say. But Dante wasn't finished. Dante turned to the other customers in the restaurant and spoke, his voice steady but powerful. "You see, respect is something that can't be bought. It's something earned. And every person in this restaurant, every waiter, every chef, every cleaner, deserves it." Some customers nodded. Others murmured in agreement. Cain's jaw clenched. He was embarrassed, angry. He grabbed a fork, shoved the raw steak away, and growled, "Just get me something else and stop this nonsense." Dante raised an eyebrow. "Of course, sir, but only if you say the magic word." Cain's face twisted. "What?" "The magic word," Dante repeated. "You know, that thing people with manners use when they ask for something." Cain looked around. People were watching, waiting. He could feel their eyes on him. His own friends weren't laughing anymore. His pride was at war with his dignity. For a long, painful moment, he hesitated. Then, finally, with gritted teeth, he muttered, "Please." Dante smiled, picked up the raw steak, and said, "Now that's more like it." Then he turned toward the kitchen. But just as he walked away, Cain, still seething, slammed his palm on the table. "You think you're clever?" he spat. "You're just a waiter, a nobody. You'll never be anything more than a servant." The whole restaurant gasped. Someone even muttered, "Oh no, he did not just say that." Dante stopped in his tracks. The smile faded from his lips, and slowly he turned back. But this time there was something new in his eyes, something that sent a chill through the entire room. Because Cain had just made the biggest mistake of his life. A cold silence swept through the restaurant. Every customer, every staff member, everyone felt the weight of what had just been said. "You're just a waiter, a nobody. You'll never be anything more than a servant." Dante stood motionless, his back still turned. But when he turned around, his expression had changed. The easy smile, the calm demeanor, it was gone. What replaced it was something deeper, something stronger. Power. Slowly, Dante took a step forward. Then another. His footsteps were the only sound in the room. He stopped at the edge of the table, placed both hands on it, and leaned in just enough for Cain to feel the shift in energy. "Let me ask you something," Dante said, his voice no longer playful but sharp as a blade. "What do you do for a living?" Cain scoffed. "I own businesses. Real businesses. I make real money. Not like you." Dante nodded slowly. "And in these businesses of yours, Do you employ people? Kane crossed his arms. Of course. Dante's lips curled into a small smirk. So that means you have people who serve you? Kane blinked. What? Dante took a step back, spreading his arms. Oh, I see. You think serving others makes someone less than... But the funny thing is, you depend on people like me. People who make your meals. People who clean your offices. People who make your life convenient. Kane's friends exchanged uneasy glances. Dante continued, his voice growing stronger. You can have all the money in the world, but take away the people who serve you, and you have nothing. No food. No service. No luxury. He tilted his head. So tell me, who's really more powerful? The man with the money? Or the people who make his life possible? The room was dead silent. Kane swallowed hard. He had no comeback. But Dante wasn't done yet. Dante straightened up, his posture tall, commanding. Let me tell you something, sir. He reached into his apron pocket and pulled out a sleek, black business card. With a casual flick of his fingers, he tossed it onto the table. Kane hesitated before picking it up. His eyes scanned the gold-embossed lettering, and then his face turned pale. His hands gripped the card tighter. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Because on that card, in bold, unmistakable print, were the words, Dante Carter, co-owner of La Belle Vie. And beneath it, another line, investor, entrepreneur, restaurateur. Kane's jaw dropped. The entire restaurant erupted into hushed whispers. One of the tourists, Kane's blonde companion, leaned over and gasped. Wait, you own this place? Dante smiled, finally relaxing. Oh, I don't just own this place. He slipped another hand into his apron and pulled out his phone. With a few taps, he turned the screen toward Kane. Displayed on the screen was a financial portfolio showing ownership stakes in 5 luxury restaurants across the city. Kane's face turned an even deeper shade of red. The realization hit him like a truck. He hadn't just insulted a waiter. He had insulted the boss. Dante let the moment hang in the air, watching Kane squirm in his seat. Then, after a long pause, he said, I could have fired you from this restaurant before you even finished your appetizer. Kane swallowed hard. He shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. Dante leaned in just slightly. And yet, even after everything you've said, I still served you. He straightened. Because that's the difference between me and you. I don't need to make someone feel small to feel important. More whispers. More nods. Customers who had witnessed the entire exchange looked at Dante with a newfound respect. Kane clenched his fists. His entire body was tense. But there was nothing he could do. Nothing he could say. He had lost. Badly. Dante smiled. Now, here's what's going to happen. He picked up the bill from the table and placed it gently in front of Kane. You're going to pay for your meal, with a big tip for my staff. And then you're going to leave. Because I only allow respectable people to dine at my restaurant. Kane's lips twisted in anger, but the weight of the moment crushed him. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and slapped a few $100 bills onto the table. He didn't say a word as he pushed back his chair and stood up. The other tourists hesitated, then followed his lead, their heads low with shame. They left the restaurant without looking back. As the door swung shut behind them, the restaurant erupted in applause. Customers clapped, some even whistled. Dante gave a small nod of thanks, but didn't bask in the moment for too long. He simply turned to Carlos, the manager, and said, Let's get back to work. And just like that, he walked away, ready to continue doing what he did best, running his empire with dignity, respect, and class. The energy in the restaurant was electric. Customers were still whispering, some shaking their heads in disbelief at what had just happened. A few even pulled out their phones, discreetly recording the aftermath, knowing they had just witnessed something legendary. But Dante? He simply went back to work. As he picked up a tray from the kitchen, Carlos, the manager, walked over and gave him a firm pat on the back. I don't know how you kept your cool, but that was incredible. Dante chuckled. It's not about losing your temper. It's about winning the moment. Carlos shook his head, still amazed. I bet that guy's ego is shattered right now. Good, Dante said simply. Some people only learn when you show them who's really in charge. Meanwhile, outside the restaurant, Kane and his friends had stopped near their car. For the first time that evening, they weren't laughing. They weren't smug. They were quiet. The blonde woman, who had been smirking and sipping her wine earlier, now looked uncomfortable. She cleared her throat and spoke. You know, you really embarrassed us in there. Kane shot her a glare. Embarrassed us? She crossed her arms. Yes, you did. That was completely unnecessary. You acted like a jerk. The other woman, the brunette with the heavy perfume, hesitated before nodding. Honestly, he handled it way better than you did. And I hate to say it, but you look stupid. Kane clenched his jaw. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being the one put in his place. One of the men in the group muttered, and he owns the place. That's wild. They stood there for a long time, the weight of what had happened sinking in. Kane, for the first time in his life, had nothing to say. Because deep down, past all the arrogance, past all the pride, he knew they were right. Back inside, Dante was finishing up his shift when an elderly couple who had witnessed the whole event waved him over. The woman, dressed in an elegant blue dress, smiled warmly. Young man, I just wanted to say, you handled that beautifully. Her husband nodded. You didn't just teach him a lesson. You taught all of us something about dignity tonight. Dante gave them a humble nod. Thank you. But to be honest, I didn't do it for them. I did it for every person who's ever been treated like they were less than. Sometimes, people need to be reminded who really holds the power. The woman squeezed his hand. Well, you reminded us all? As they left, Dante glanced around the restaurant. He could feel a respect, not just because he owned the place, but because of the way he carried himself. That was real power. Not money, not titles. Respect. And Kane? Well, he would never forget this night. Ever. The story of what happened that night spread fast. People talked about it for weeks. Some even called it the night the waiter became the boss moment. Kane never showed his face at La Bellevue again. But something did change about him after that night. Because for the first time, he had been made to feel small, and maybe, just maybe, he finally understood what that felt like. And as for Dante, he kept running his business with the same grace and strength he always had, proving every day that true power doesn't come from looking down on others. It comes from lifting yourself up without stepping on anyone else. And that's a lesson the world will never forget. Now, I need your help. If you love this story and want to see more like it, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories that make you think. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. See you in the next one.